So, Angeli, Mark, any questions before we uh, wrap up?
I have a question on the on method. Like I think at least I usually associate environmental history with a more macro approach. But at the same time, look at the examples that you've mentioned to us, like the 1881, what happened in Mayon. You also look at a very micro historical approach. So, and sometimes this is a common problem with historians. How do you handle evidence or analysis at different scales? So, how do you sort of reconcile this in your research?
I mean, I agree with you, Mark. I mean, but I don't have any. I mean, I think there's a place for both in historiography, and you're right. I mean, the ones that I have been talking about are the projects I'm talking about have been particularly micro sort of studies in a sense, but I'm very much a large vision person as well. As you know, the whole idea of cultures of disaster is very large, I think. But I mean, another project that I'm working on, but again, only begun to, but it will give you an idea, is the work I've been doing on what I call Aeolian empires, which is how wind and current affect colonial states. In other words, if you actually try and map the maritime empires from the 16th century onwards, onto a map of winds and currents, you'll find that there's a remarkable coincidence or between where European colonialists went and actually the winds and currents that took them there. So I mean, the Portuguese Empire would be the classic example of this. But so this is a very macro kind of picture. But I'm also something we haven't discussed. I mean, I very much looking at another project which is looking at winds around the Philippines too. So I'm thinking, we think about land and we think about water. There's lots of histories written on that, but we don't really think about the winds around the Philippines. And so it's a project I called Islands in the Wind, and it's really looking at the way in which currents, wind systems, trade routes, typhoons, diasporas, colonizers, whatever energy supplies in the future, perhaps, looking at the various. So, in a sense, I find it quite easy to take the large picture as well, but then when you want to zoom in, so to speak, it's just the way you actually want to present history, because you're doing the same thing. With the macro picture, you're presenting a large idea. With the micro study, you're usually looking at a small incident, but you're actually using it as a vehicle to discuss larger things. It's just a different approach sometimes, and that really depends on the kind of evidence that you have available to you. To me, I mean, nowadays, after 30 years, I can look at a document and think, that's what I can do with it. That this is a micro study that I can talk about larger things, or it's a part of a macro study that will illustrate a larger picture. But it's just a question of letting the data tell you what best it can actually do for you in that sense. How that comes about, I guess, is just a question of years in the end, of looking at being able, it's almost instantaneous to me. I can start reading something and think, yeah, this is what I can do with it, and this is what it will do. This is how to do it in that way. So to me, it's just very interchangeable. But in the end, what you're doing is you are looking at larger questions. It's just a different way of doing it.
A follow-up question, Mark?
I have one last question.
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's when you talked about the co-volcanic societies. I think my question is, what does it say about Philippine society? That that the engineers don't think about the eruption of the volcano when they construct the roads, that people keep coming back there. And I remember, I don't know, this was years ago when you were in Ateneo, I think in the year 2000. I think you made a comment like, Ateneo University, Katipunan, we're along the Marikina fault line. And then there are high rises and condominiums there. And I remember you made a comment like, like why would you build really tall buildings next to a fault line. And then if you've seen Katipunan Avenue now, it's even worse.
Oh,
There are even more tall buildings. So
absolutely.
what does it say about Philippine society? It's just I don't know.
Does it say anything particular about Philippine society, Mark? I would say, I mean, because it's worldwide, and in the Philippines, I mean, the big question that always has interested me, and it's one I can't answer yet, is, you know, what I've been doing through my scholarship over the decades is tracing this gradual adaptation and resilience of living in the kind of world that the Philippines is in terms of disasters. How this evolves during the Spanish period with a sort of, you know, in the end, a sort of a mixture of Spanish technology and indigenous technology in house building and way things are done. And of course, it doesn't stop or prevent the disaster, but they are really pretty effective mitigating measures. Even under the Americans, you see a continuation of this. Now, what the hell happens is the big question to me, because as you're right, I mean, you know, when I was teaching at Ateneo at that particular time, I was living in, you know, the 11th story of in a small room in Katipunan on the avenue looking down. And I knew that if there was an earthquake, yeah, I didn't have a very good chance. I didn't like the structure of the building, didn't, you know, and I remember trying to persuade one of my colleagues who also lived in the building not to buy the flat that she was living in, because I thought it would be a very bad idea, you know, and because I was on the 11th floor and there were 13, I would run up, not run down in an earthquake and try and ride it down, you know. What happens? I think the big turning point is World War II. And what happens as now, whether it's the disaster that happens during World War II in terms of the actual material damage, because it's enormous. It really is absolutely staggering around Luzon. I mean, I've been gathering data on the Philippine War Damage Commission. Again, it's one of those projects I have sort of shelved away for happier times. And you know, the data there suggests that in many cases, 90% of towns were destroyed. 90%, you know, absolutely staggering down. So it is the rebuilding after, and of course, Manila was the second worst damaged city in the world after Warsaw, is judged in terms of the material damage. Is it something that happens as a result of the devastation of World War II and the need to rebuild as quickly as possible? It may be some. As I said, I have these. This is all speculative. I mean, it's just things that I'm turning over in my mind, because that seems to be the turning point. Now, whether you can blame it just on World War II and all the economics that happens there, we've got to think about concepts of modernity and fashion too, because they're really important in what people want to live in. You know, the idea that concrete blocks signify progress and modernity and rising and you know, rising living standards. What's so interesting, just sorry to hark back to what we were talking about in the past, that when we're talking about fire and earthquake, because of course fire and earthquake in Manila in the past were almost contradictory kinds of disasters, because you built in hard materials to stop it burning, but if you build in hard materials in an earthquake, it fell down and killed you. So you had to get this sort of synergy between the two. And what's interesting is that as soon as there were tremors in Manila, in Intramuros, all the people who lived in the casas fuertes, you know, the strong houses, high-tailored out to the nipa and palm huts to wait till the tremors had passed, right? Because they knew damn well that, okay, you know, maybe the roof came down on them, but it wasn't going to kill them. You know, so why do we lose all that? Why do we lose all that kind of knowledge? Now, actually, I was talking to both of your colleagues just the other day in environmental sciences, and she had just moved, or we were talking about flooding, and she was telling me that she'd moved houses, and we were talking about the way that people adapted their electrical systems in areas of Manila that are prone to flooding, in terms of having the fridge and such like on a sort of cases or bench or up from the sockets weren't at the bottom, but were halfway up or at the top of the, these are adaptations. And I've seen it and how in some cases people, she was telling me, had adapted their bottom floors so that they could be flooded because they didn't have any of their living, or the kitchen wasn't there, and all this kind of stuff. So there is some kind of adaptation that is going on, but we seem to have lost it. And again, I don't think this is in any way unique to the Philippines. I mean, it's obvious there, but I've seen it in Britain too. I mean, when I first arrived in Hull, there was a major, well, I just arrived just after a major flood, and I was put on the commission looking at investigating what had happened. And it was quite clear to me, the stupidity of people repairing, the government going around repairing houses and putting the stuff right back in the same way as it was before, just waiting for the next flood. That seemed to me insane, the thing to do. They're not learning from it. So, sorry, this is a very rambling answer to your question, but I think there is something that happens post 1945, whether the war is actually the catalyst, but something happens there where we tend to, in large ways, ignore the historical adaptation of centuries, goes out the window. Why that is the case, somewhat difficult to tell. I mean, and as I said, I think there are probably lots of factors involved there, but that seems to me the crunch time. And it seems to me a really big question to ask. Again, we could talk about rising population. I mean, there's all sorts of factors that come in here that may mitigate, or sorry, may actually be the cause of this change. But the big thing is, why would we ignore all that hard-earned, hard-won knowledge and just chuck it out the window? But do it. I think it's too easy to say it's capitalism, though clearly there is some element of that there as well.
Any questions or maybe a comment you want to share with Greg?
They've gone to sleep, Mike.
Actually, I was thinking, Dr. Greg, because you were doing research on Mayon and the population near it, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever considered doing research on the Taal volcano, which is also a highly popular tourist destination? There are even people living on the slopes of the volcano itself.
Yeah. I haven't, Gillian, but I mean, the same could be true. The reason, as I said, why I chose Mayon, because Mayon has actually erupted 50 times since recorded history, and probably a lot more because we have almost no data. We have one reference of 1616, and then there's nothing really till 1766. And clearly the volcano didn't stop erupting for 200 years or 150 years. It went on erupting. It wasn't recorded. So that's why I chose. I mean, Taal is the other obvious one to take, and it's very close to Manila. But yes, I mean, I think you could do the same. And again, perhaps the proximity of Manila would be an important factor in influencing population densities around Taal. I know a lot of people have sort of summer houses, or I mean, it's become quite fashionable, hasn't it? I mean, around in terms of living in those areas. But clearly, I think the same argument could be made. Where you get to sort of volcanoes that are up much less frequently, like up in Pinatubo, for instance, there I think it's the co-volcanic society argument probably doesn't work, because if you're waiting 400 years for an eruption, even if it is catastrophic, it's gone beyond memory. A lot of people's behavior and actions is determined by their personal history, of experience of disasters. And by I mean personal history, I don't mean just in their own lifetimes, but up to their grandparents. That maybe better call it familial history, because that's a living experience. If your grandma or your grandpa tells you something about a volcano, then that's still within living memory. But once you get to great grandparents and beyond, it begins to start to fade. One of the people I interviewed in around Mayon was an old lady who was in her 80s. And while she told me about her own experiences of eruptions back to the 1930s, her most vivid experience, interestingly, was a tale that she had heard as a young girl from her grandmother. So now, and her grandmother could go back to the 1897 eruption. And that was fantastic because it was almost like having a first-hand account of the 1897 eruption via her grandmother. So, I mean, she was 80. We're going back, I don't know how old her grandmother was, time fairly young. But, she was telling me stories based on her grandmother's account that you just wouldn't get in history and any historical sources because they were sort of filmic, almost, visions. People standing in the water with pictures of the saints above their head to protect themselves. A whole lot of women who'd been caught by noxious gases and things, who'd been drying their hair and had their heads hanging out of the window and combing their hair, and had just died like that. So there was a whole sort of like series of these sort of almost filmic images of the disaster, and they were very vivid in her mind. So that was and that's about the extent of what I would call familial or personal. So we get back to 1897, but we wouldn't get back, for instance, to 1814. 1814, it's got to be written accounts. So again, with Tal, I don't know, I haven't done the detailed history around that. As I said, I think it would be a bit more complicated because, but clearly you could do the same kind of thing. But it has to be a volcano that erupts frequently, not very infrequently.
Thanks, Jillian. Angeli, any final word from you before we end our interview?
Right, I just want to comment. I'm so amazed about the places that you find yourself in for the love of disaster studies. So I wish you the best. Take care.
Thank you, Angeli. Yeah. Well, I mean, what's always interesting about disasters is, of course, it's is that, and it's like politics too. I mean, I think I was in Manila for EDSA 3, and it's like going around a corner. On one side of the road, or on one corner, life is perfectly normal. You go around the corner, and it's just completely different. And disasters are a bit like that. So as you move away from the disaster, suddenly life, there's a point where there's this sort of like, changeover from normality to abnormality. Though I wouldn't use those terms actually, because my argument would be, of course, that actually, because disasters are so frequent in the Philippines, that perhaps we should think about the question, what's normal is very different to what generally we think of as normal. So, it might be normal to be exposed to a hazard. I mean, I guess if I ask the four of you, which one of you hasn't lived through a major typhoon, earthquake, flood, or whatever, would any of you be able to tell me that they hadn't? I'm taking the silence to being that So I mean that you see, I mean, but just by presenting it that way, now if we were in the UK, maybe one of you would have said, I'm sorry, one of you may have said I had experienced a major flood, probably would be the main thing, but most of them probably wouldn't. So I mean, there just illustrates the really different perspective, I think.
Thanks, Greg. And if if there are no more questions for Greg, maybe we can end this interview. Thank you very much, Greg, for your time. I mean, this is one uh, big opportunity for us and to showcase the work published here in the journal. And we also want to promote your upcoming research projects. So thank you very much for joining us, for your time.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you for asking me
thank you very much. You'll
take
be
part.
arriving here in Manila towards the end of the year.
Hopefully, sometime, yeah. I mean, that's it's if things work out properly. I mean, we don't, at the moment, I'm not allowed to leave or enter. So
Yeah,
it's kind of
yeah.
problematic at the moment. Yeah, but hopefully,
Okay. So
yeah.
we hope to see you soon, and we're hoping that you're safe there. Thank you very much, and there
Okay.
on behalf of the whole
Nice
journal, thank you very much.